I am aware that many find it more important to emphasize the death of the man, the horrendous conditions of torture in detention, the whole ill treatment of Biko as the definitive picture of the man. Whereas this is true, I do not believe that somebody who had much to offer through literature and political action should have all his active life blotted out of attention in favor of what he could not control. Death was brought to Biko by others. It was an act of others on him. Ironically, their act has now become the most superior item in all his illustrious existence. Year in, year out, we remind ourselves about this death. The downside of this compulsive obsession with Biko's death is that whereas the pain of loss is soothed by the repeated ritual of revisiting the event of the September 12, 1977, life principles represented by the work of the man are kept away from public attention. There is much more that we stand to reap from Biko, and at the same time, Biko deserves much more than we are doing. We need to be as free-spirited as we can and take interest in the exercise of exploring the history of the man, and at the same time, in assessing our own possibilities as a people while mapping our destiny together. As we stand at this point in history, we now know that through trial and error, this man, Biko, threw his body and mind into an old fire, the invisible war that was started by his ancestors. He brought new energy and a revitalized spirit when he took charge and control over what he knew and over the reality he faced. In his words, and also translated in his political actions, I write what I like. Biko is very special to black people and to humanity generally. For us blacks, Biko represents excellence, wisdom, and the revered African personality. His success in unearthing the most creative generation in the history of the struggle for the liberation of South Africa, the Black Consciousness generation. His ways of creating a unique literary trend, the Black Consciousness literature, within the broader African literature. His precision in crafting proven methods in community development and empowerment, and his centrality in the creation of an African-oriented ideology, the Black Consciousness ideology, speaks to the excellence, the wisdom, the personality of the man. Biko represents a sense of progress in black people as far as original thinking is concerned, inventing new approaches, discovering hidden energies, building systems with proven imprint, understanding our strengths and noticing aspects of our weaknesses and vulnerability. Biko is a true representation of the state of fearlessness, far-sightedness, cool-headedness, and of course, calmness, all combined. His boldness is very, very intelligent. Biko is a strong influence when it comes to the question of racism. He understood the essential role of social and political institutions in entrenching racism. His force of intellectual power demonstrates itself whenever he deals with the effects of racism on the psychology of black people. His work reflects a deep dedication to help blacks alleviate themselves from the psychological hold of racism. Through Biko, we came to know that racism is a crucial and central dimension in black experience. His teachings about superiority and inferiority complexes and how these mutate themselves over time are legend. Biko was never of those blacks who had been longing to use white men's toilets or shopping in their exclusive stores or eating in their restaurants. Here we had a man who was happy in observing whites, looking very closely and thoroughly at people who never had time to notice us. The care he put in observing white people while evaluating our future placed us much higher than whites. Through Biko, we became experts of social analysis. But it is our reaction to racist provocations that I worry so much about, especially us blacks on the continent of Africa. I make special reference to blacks on the continent because we run, or we are supposed to run, our governments here. Therefore, we have the numerical strength, justice and power to alter our situation. Yes, racism does hurt, and it hurts deeply. It hurts when a lone white woman looks through the window and on seeing black people swimming in the waters of the Durban coast, she screams loud that she sees monkeys and baboons. It hurts when a young white boy walks on a beach in Greece, writes to his fellow racist that he's happy because there are no black bodies in the waters of Greece. But inasmuch as we can be consumed by the pain that comes with every provocation in everyday racism, we need to consider this important truth. Our people are reeling under the psychological damage of white racism. We are living with a stubborn residue of mental slavery. The actions of the police and the army in this country are proof that it is not easy to dislodge mind enslavement. This state of being is very costly on black people. It is my view that blacks need to confront the psychological scars that were caused by racism through its institutions, through racist encounters, and all sorts of racist practices and experiences. We need a practical program that will be designed by blacks themselves that involves the writing of books and development of training programs, an anti-racist discourse that focuses its attention on the black mind. We need to talk about struggles waged by our people against racism. In other words, we should create knowledge about racism from the position of experience. This is supposed to be an international project that should be geared at shifting the perspective and at providing a credible solution to racism. For all those out there who are well-meaning human beings who wish to support this work, your enthusiasm is highly welcomed. Feel free to connect so that we can join hands across the seas. Steve Biko was a thinker. He was a thinker who took to deep thinking, not for the pleasure of thinking, but for the pressure of feeling compelled to confront and think through the questions of his day. In literature, there are great writers who have read widely, who had the pleasure of resources, time and support for their literary pursuits. I respect these writers, but there is another breed of writers who were faced by huge questions while experiencing difficult circumstances. For instance, people who wrote their books while in prison or under conditions of exile or homelessness with very little resources. Biko belongs to this category of thinkers and writers. Biko was a child of a poor single parent. His father died when he was 4 years. His mother was a domestic worker who took care of 4 other children, many grandchildren, 2 sisters who had children too, all living under one roof. As a young man who was always thirsty for reading, Biko relied on neighbors for magazines and old newspapers. Although the material that was available to him does not need to be judged for its quality, Biko was a kind of person who put to use every bit of information that he came across with. He was a member of a student debating society during his school days, and as a result of his active participation and enthusiasm and support from members of his community, he became the chairperson of the debating society. To further expand on difficult conditions that produced Biko, in his first year at college, Lovedale College, Biko was expelled by the principal of Lovedale, Mr. Vach, together with his brother, who was politically active at the time. The security police had visited Lovedale to arrest Biko's brother, Kaya. They must have said something treasonous to the principal because the man there and there decided to clean his college of any Biko child. Having just enrolled in the last 2 months, having not shown any truancy or rebellion towards the authorities of the college, the expulsion of Biko was a provocation. He had to sit the whole of 1963 without education. Even when he had started to be active, Biko would be detained for long periods and be held in isolation. With scant resources but a burning interest to grow his mind on the one hand and the unending flurry of difficulties on the other hand, a bigger difficulty was added on Biko. In 1973, Steve Biko was placed under a banning order. Many political activists who were banned before or during his time could not manage the trauma of being banned. They either escaped the country to live in exile or simply gave up the fight for liberation. Yet, these are the conditions that shaped Steve Biko. The late Kwame Ture, Stockley Carmichael, used to say, we must be thankful to the difficulties because it is the difficulties that make us strong. I want to repeat this one. We must be thankful to the difficulties because it is difficulties that makes us strong. Biko's political life was started at the end of a tumultuous road in the political struggle of South Africa. In the 1960s, South Africa was standing at the end of the road. It was not a junction where there would have been a privilege to choose which path to follow. The banning of organizations such as the ANC and the PAC, the imprisonment of leaders such as Nelson Mandela and Mangaliso Sobukwe, and the exiling of many was like an end of the road. Biko's political forebears, dating back to the wars of land dispossession, had at different periods in history carried the burden of our freedom, passing through points of doubt and despair, leaving behind illustrious stories of heroism that inspired future generations. When Biko's moment came, it was clear that his generation of activists was charged to chart a new path. Whereas the dilemma of the end of the road situation that confronted Biko's political generation could have been a huge mountain to climb, it instead provided a great advantage for the black university students of the 1960s. Men and women who were students at universities and colleges in South Africa in the 1960s had not forgotten their history. They knew the history of the struggle for freedom like the palm of their hands. Most of them had been affected by the struggle. Some came from political family because elder brother Kaya was an active Pan-Africanist who had strong ideas about Africa and African people. Bani Pichana is a grandson of one of the great literary and political figures ever to come from Southern Africa, S.E.K. Mqhayi. Ranwezi Nengwekulu, whose father was a very political man who taught all his children the history of land dispossession. So it was natural for that generation to lay claim to their history and to embrace it with pride, because that history is about them and their people and their land. In other words, it is their history. Those students were able to compose themselves as the new generational energy that has inherited a national mission. Accordingly, they opened themselves to the great lessons of the history of struggle as led by their forebears. Now, that position placed them in an advantage to know much more. On the basis of what they were learning from their history, they could assess themselves and their time as well as assess the enemy at that particular stage. On the basis of their capabilities, they could establish some sense of purpose on their part and a possibility of a meaningful existence. This was empowering them to a point where they could establish reasonable expectations when judging their capabilities and possibilities. Their keenness towards history opened them to priceless wisdoms and invaluable coping skills that were accumulated over years of trial and error by their ancestors. Assessing yourself to crucial aspects of your past opens your eyes to crucial aspects of your contemporary and future realities. Also, you cannot be easily misdirected in life when you are in grasp of your past. From the start, Biko's generation understood the importance of the sense of continuity and the dangers of disconnection. They based themselves on a long-term, conceptual, sequential, relational, cause and effect kind of thinking. They employed this approach on all issues of the struggle. In building black consciousness, they put a detailed consideration of the reality of the now and the reality of the distant past and how these relate with the reality of the future. They did not limit themselves to the now, in which case they would have had insufficient insight and foresight. They were motivated at building a new state of being that would place black people in a position of power. Steve Biko was the key driver of this new beginning. This is a beginning that saw the founding of the SASO newsletter, a voice and a public platform for communities and students to discuss and to debate. The newsletter was started when Biko was the director of SASO Publications under the second president of SASO after Biko, Bani Pijana, who is now a retired professor of law and theology. The SASO newsletter took the art of writing in black communities by storm, from the point of aesthetic enjoyment and social moral value, passing the mark of intellectual purpose, and it placed writing at a point where it could demonstrate the abundance of black experience and its quality of transcendence. What do I mean by quality of transcendence? Quality of transcendence is an expression used by Dr. Amiya Chakravarti when he was editing the works of Tagore. Writing in 1961, Dr. Chakravarti said, I quote, "Man is born with the capacity to transcend himself and his surroundings. In art, he reveals this quality of transcendence." Let us give this quotation a gender facelift. All human beings are born with the capacity to transcend themselves and their surroundings. In art, humans reveal this quality of transcendence. Close quote. Through the SASO newsletter, Biko's political generation composed itself as a generation of writers, adding to a rich history of literature seen in the days of the drum generation of writers such as Peter Abraham, S.K. Mphahlele, Louis Ngosi, Ken Temba, and many other writers. Of course, the drum magazine generation comes from the drum magazine of the 1950s here in South Africa. They came on the heels of yet another generation of writers, the class of the 1940s, whose key figures were the Congress Youth League. Here we are talking about writers, historians, and revolutionaries such as Anton Limbede, A.P. Mda, O.R. Tambo, Nelson Mandela, who led from the front. This class of the 1940s was following in the steps of writers who were pioneers of the 1920s, Samuel Edward Khune Kai, the Dlomo brothers, Vilakazi, and Solomon Plaatje, to name but a few. So the SASO newsletter could not afford to be a mere student mouthpiece. It had to become a publication where communities were expressing their feelings of displeasure, anger, hope, and love through mediums such as poetry, painting, short story, and novel. There was a flurry of emotional energy because the black consciousness message had awakened the emotions of the people, and outlets such as the SASO newsletter were there to catch and preserve the people's voices. As the SASO newsletter was up and running, hitting the streets of big cities in South Africa and abroad, a new tradition of writing was born. In other words, a great harvest of thought and literature was conceived. And at the center of it was this young columnist whose articles were later lifted into a book form with the title, I Write What I Like